make your decisions, and you need to make many as a designer because it's a huge mystery to solve. There's no pattern and you just execute that pattern.
Today I'm joined by Scott Howard, Head of Design at MBN Co.
As a designer, you're really an enabler most of the time.
After years of mechanical engineering, product innovation and management consulting, Scott brings a unique perspective on how to align design teams with business objectives.
If the business case doesn't stack up, the great design doesn't get out there.
Work on something small, prove your worth, and then start to move up the ladder in terms of changing things.
Every function in the business is important, but as a designer, I'd say probably go for the areas that you wouldn't normally.
He's worked at major companies like QBE and ResMed, discovering how to balance user-centric design with real-world corporate demands.
One of the learnings I had at QBE was you don't have to design everything to 100% optimization. It's about trying to get more value.
How do you build out an understanding of what the metrics should be before kicking off projects? So what's the return on investment back to the business? How am I going to measure this project at each stage to know if it's on track or off track?
I think there's two layers to it.
My name is Joe Woodham. Welcome to All Things Design, the podcast that unpacks how design drives digital transformation. Today we're speaking with Scott Howard, Head Design from NBN Co. How are you today, Scott?
I'm very well, thanks, Joe.
Take me on your journey of understanding, as a designer, going from being a good designer at the craft and then having to understand, what the business objectives were and then how to align that back and communicate properly to stakeholders.
I'm not sure I consciously thought of that from the get-go. When I look back, and I think it was about originally designing products and then kind of services and then thinking about business models of being interested in how would you design a whole business, and needing to understand, or recognizing that I needed to understand more and more about how do things work. And that turning point for me very specifically was when I was at ResMed, and we were designing breathing masks for sleep apnea at really high volume, millions of patients ultimately. And over time I moved into the future. We'd never said innovation because everyone is an innovator, but let's call it more innovation, future. What's the next iteration of products, etc., and where are we going? And starting to spin up more experimental projects to test, and then developing business cases and realizing if the business case doesn't stack up, the great design doesn't get out there. And I worked on a really, really great disposable mask concept that from a human-centered design perspective was awesome. Less obtrusive, less sort of shame, much better compliance, easier to fit. It hit all of these challenges that we'd been designing for these other masks, but because it was disposable, it didn't stack up with the commercial model and with the way that insurance companies, mostly in the US, but all around the world, would reimburse and therefore basically pay for the product. And that really piqued my interest. So we had this great design, tested really well. You could make it, it was feasible, it was desirable, but the viable part didn't stack up. And it wasn't exactly a light bulb moment in a split second or anything like that, but that really piqued my interest around understanding, well, how does all that work and what are those constraints and drivers and so on. So I jumped out of that and went into management consulting for a few years. It was sort of an MBA or management consulting, and I went down the more practical, perhaps, management consulting route. And I guess over time, I really enjoyed a lot of that, very much different to being a designer or even often creating anything tangible, so that we can talk about the challenges there. It's a bit off topic. But coming back into design, service design, strategic design and customer experience, for me, I guess developed that almost instinct that if what you were doing or putting forward didn't have a good business case behind it or good fundamentals in terms of the commercial viability, it just wasn't going to get up. So that's Joe. That's sort of where it started.
Perfect. Let's start there. So you've gone from management consulting back into the design realm. When you started getting briefs, what was the first step that you now started taking to go, all right, this is the brief. How do I align this back to the business goal or the metrics? Or how do I define the metrics from a maybe user perspective and a business perspective, bring them together so I understand what we're building for?
I might take the answer in a slightly different angle. Maybe not so much briefs. When I came into QBE, that was probably the really big big corporate experience, um, what I noticed was there was a real design at the time was really hot. It was about 2016, and designers were getting jobs all over the place with a lot of, I guess, trust, or a lot of hype, and that just dropping designers into large corporates would yield amazing stuff. And and I came in with a so I had a really awesome opportunity to be that person who comes in and takes over the reins from a consultancy who've sold the dream, and then do that transition, and then end up being the owner of that dream. And I sort of came in, and a dream had been sold, and some awesome, cool, colorful, beautiful work was happening. Um, but it had been sold with a lot of hype, and it wasn't clear to me how the value was going to be realized, say, a year down the track, when I'd be holding it and building up my own team to then deliver that work and subsequent work. So rather than a brief, it was almost pitched in, if you like, from outside, and then I was picking it up. And so what did I do about that? I guess I then sought really quickly to understand the business and how the business works, and ensure that where we were going, that we had the end in mind. And there's commerciality, there's also feasibility, whether it's operations, technical, etc. Compliance, really important in pretty much every industry I've worked in, mostly highly regulated industries. So I guess started shaping the work we were doing as consumable tools, artifacts, reference points, etc., as well as the people who would consume those, to make sure that those folks would go on, because those are the folks who generally create the value. As a designer, you're really an enabler most of the time, perhaps unless you're in a really small organization. So it was understanding the downstream, if you like, take up of the work we were doing, as well as the big picture sort of relevance of that work.
Let's rewind a second. So you obviously
Mm.
have gone into QBE.
Mhm.
They've been, I guess, promised this shiny object that might work, and you've kind of gone in. Was that quite low maturity from a design perspective? You've gone in, gone, I don't know about the long-term viability, and you've kind of had to work with the business to understand that. In such a regulated industry, how did the business, I guess, take to you coming in, go and asking questions and going, "Hey, maybe we need to try it this way"? Like, was there much friction, and was that a big hurdle you had to overcome?
No, not friction so much. Like, that was part of the plan. So I came in at a time where there was a CEO-sponsored transformation program to be more customer-centric. So I stepped into a role with a lot of opportunity. So that wasn't opposed really in any way. It was more my own, I suppose, initiative in thinking down the track, in terms of, well, how would this work be picked up and usable? So asking questions, shaping it, and that's part of my role.
Yep.
I guess the challenge for me was the doing that in flight. So we
Yep.
didn't have a lot of time to sit back and plan out. There was a lot of stuff and a lot of parallel work going on. So perhaps some um, sort of in-flight prioritization around uh, around the changes that we made. Um, yeah, and this was also a learning process as well. So again, didn't suddenly have a light bulb moment and change everything overnight. As we went through and started to pick up how the organisation worked and what was relevant, tweak things over time. And sometimes that can just be language.
Yep. Let's talk through that, because I think the language thing,
Mm,
once again, it's that topic that keeps coming up. It's like designers, when they are going through their early stages of their design career, really focus on being a great designer, and that's how they communicate. They talk about
mm,
everything design, with the hot topic, sort of trends, whatever's going on in design world at that time.
mm.
How did you sort of learn how to link that back to the business metrics and start communicating? It's almost reversing it, right? So like, you could talk about the customer, but how did you talk about the impact back to the business and the impact back to the stakeholders? Like, how did you sort of take yourself on that journey?
So I would say for me personally, it was curiosity led kind of endeavor to understand, well, how does this business work? How does it make money? And I'd been in the management consulting world for 6 odd years, something like that prior, with a stint in a digital agency. I can talk about that too, but very focused on strategy and commerciality. So it was my own interest reading the annual report and then seeking out the gurus who were very, very happy to tell you, how does this business work? The ecosystem that we're in, what are the drivers and the dynamics and all that sort of thing. So that was okay for me. But as I built up a team and sort of recognized that there's a real tension, let's say tension, between the idealistic, enthusiastic, high energy designer that wants to change the world, and they want to talk to the CEO on the first day and tell he or she, everything that's wrong, all that sort of stuff. That's awesome stuff. But I think in my role over the last several years, it's been about taking that and pointing that at, not limiting it at all, but shaping and sort of crafting that so that awesome energy and creativity and so on does yield business results. So the way I went about it then, and I've done similar things since, was creating an onboarding for the team that didn't really exist in the standard onboarding. So really, how does this company work? How does the ecosystem work? How does what we do? How does a customer journey translate through all the layers of intermediaries and employee experience and all this stuff, tech stack, etc. And basically, how do we make money, and or how do we be compliant, avoid risk, and that sort of thing. Hopefully, and so that I and then we, as a broader team, sort out the gurus, set up a mini program of onboarding that was like a supplement to the standard onboarding when you came into QBE. And I saw that for me personally as necessity to understand, if you can't talk to how this company works and how we make money, etc., you just won't get you won't get the credibility first, let alone the attention to bring to life your great ideas. Yeah.
Can I ask a question on that? Because you said you've kind of built a small part of like the next gen of onboarding with who they need to understand, what they need to understand about the business. If I was someone in a similar position to you that hasn't maybe done that already, can you kind of talk me through maybe who the gurus would be in this scenario, or some of the training areas that you'd look at? Because like if I was a design leader, where would I start? Like, what would I be looking at?
Okay, so yeah. Well, look, I would say, so one, how do we make money? So someone in sales might be a good start, or maybe someone in finance. And honestly, ask that question to the right person, they will talk your ear off.
Sales, how I make commission. Yep.
But so, and probably also the people that have been there for a long time. So you probably want to cover off how we make money, the sales, the environment that we're in, the ecosystem. How does this industry work? Those dynamics, like that might be the same person or might be someone different. So if you're looking for maybe, let's say, the sales and finance, operational stuff, maybe technically, maybe IT or someone from the tech part of the business, and probably someone around risk compliance and that sort of area. Find those people. I mean, every function in the business is important, but as a designer, I'd say probably go for the areas that you wouldn't normally, if that makes sense, that you'd probably know that might sound really dull, and it might be dull for you, but it's really not for some people.
So let's look at that. So easier said than done, right? Like if you're working in a startup, you know where to look. When you're looking at a QBE or an NBN, how do you find the right people? Like, how do you do they ask you to go and find these people and then you connect the dots? 'Cause like, Do you just go onto
I,
the company intranet and go, "Oh, this person has finance in their title. Let's see what happens."
I would
How do you
say
see?
just figure it out. I mean, when I joined MBN, I asked up one or two levels to say who do I need to talk to understand how this place works. I got some names, and I just hunted out and said, hey, my boss recommended we have a chat because I'm keen to understand how your part of the business works. No one said no at all.
Yeah,
And then other talking to other people, if you express that you're interested in understanding how the business works, honestly, everyone will give you their time to share their knowledge. If you're genuinely curious and authentic in trying to understand like their world or their part of the business, and you're valuing their knowledge always. So yeah, no, I would ask your one up or two up when you get the opportunity, and just I just want to understand how the business works better,
yep.
and go from there.
And how would you say, like, you obviously built a team, you've done it, QBE and
Mm.
MBN. Like, how would you say that this has helped impact your designers understanding the business, and then most importantly, the communication style back to their work?
I think perhaps what comes to mind when you when you ask is going back to that designer enthusiasm and idealism and that sort of stuff. One of the learnings I had at QB was you don't have to design everything to 100% optimization. And if I think about design, if I'm expressing what design is to folks who aren't in the world of design, sometimes I just talk about it's about optimizing. It's about trying to get more value, or less risk. So you could be trying to optimize to be, really risk mitigated, and you're thinking about the customer risks that maybe you haven't thought through in your other role. Um, but I think where it translates is it's empathy for your colleagues and empathy for your business and the situation that's in, which then means that you can make your decisions. And you need to make many as a designer because it's a huge mystery to solve, right? There's no pattern, and you just execute that pattern and it's done. It's a very high cognitive load and stress thing to do. And some of those decisions are around how far do we push this? You know, what's the opportunity here? And it's a bit of a risk too for designers. If you push too hard, I heard the term years ago, donor organ rejection. If you go in as this, you know, bleeding edge innovation team into a really sort of incumbent organization, you might not get cut through, and you might just out the other side and not get a
Yeah.
chance. So maybe I've over adapted and haven't pushed the boundaries enough in my career. I don't know, but I like to think that I've practiced that empathy for the organization, and been very adaptive and dialed how design to something in, how design something is up and down to suit the purpose, whether it's time, whether it's budget, whether it's just readiness, and really importantly, whether it's cognitive load too for your colleagues, because yes, you're dealing with lots of tricky stuff, but I think a really important thing for designers to recognize as an enabler in that business is you think, let's say, customer centric or human centric, which is really good, but other folks are dealing with tons of other hard stuff, and that could be technical things, it could be operational things, or whatever. And what we often represent is more problems, more more stuff to think about, right? So if you've got limited bandwidth, let's say, and you're trying to get sort of cut through, one, you can get the right language, but you really know the right sort of priorities, because you can't necessarily say, here's this whole complex new thing. You've got to think about all these risks and all these opportunities. It can really help you calibrate, can really help you prioritize where you focus your energy, which ultimately is finite.
I think that's a really good point. To a degree, starting small, understanding the business, understanding where the business is, and then taking off a challenge that isn't going to change the world in one shot. Just like work on something small, prove your worth, get to understand how things move and how they work, and then start to move up the ladder in terms of changing things if you can. Cool. So, like, let's say moving forward, like, would you say with the designs, once a designer understands or has spoken to different areas of the business, and they sort of understand the communication or the language that they need to sort of be communicating back to the business, how would you get them to understand, going back to that initial thing on the metrics side of things? Like, yes, we are trying to solve this problem for the customer. Now you understand these areas of the business. So how are you going to link that back to finance or operations? Like, how do you get them to understand that dollar value and how that translates?
I think it's hard on any front. It maybe depends what kind of design team you are. So, and what I mean by that is if you're maybe a B2C sort of UX team, you have very clear metrics and you can show cause and effect. I'm not saying it's easy at all, but I think it's easier than where you're maybe a real like enabler, service design kind of enabler, and you're maybe doing some kind of intervention over here. It's super hard to quantitatively link through. So I would say, I guess one, it's not every designer's job to do all that linking. That's potentially more senior designers, the leaders of those designers, and that sort of thing. There's levels of how conscious are you, how literate are you in these concepts versus it's on you to link through everything you do to business value.
Yeah.
All right. So I'd probably think about it qualitatively for any designers rather than quantitatively. And I know we're talking about metrics here, but I guess conceptually, if you can talk about the relative value or merit or cause and effect of doing something and the outcome that might have, I think that's probably enough for a lot of
Yeah.
designers to be able to use that language. Again, you get that credibility and so on and so forth. It's not on you to be doing everything. And we know that linking sort of customer experience and that sort of thing to hard financials is hard for anyone, and there are entire teams that do that and really struggle to do that with really advanced analytics and so on. So I would probably start there. It's the conceptual stuff. Now you can go and talk to people and get that understanding. Do you need to go and do an MBA or 5 years of management consulting or whatever? But not necessarily. And people's curiosity, and it depends on the industry you're in and that sort of thing. And I've got my own preferences and biases and curiosities as well. But I think maybe just think about that baseline of literacy and being able to express, like, how do we make money? What are the biggest things that our key stakeholders are thinking about and worrying about that, and how does what we do affect them? A little bit like if you're thinking about customers out there, and the company that we're in is a little component of their lives, whereas every company thinks they're at the center of their customers' lives and all that sort of stuff. Again, you're but one person or team that this stakeholder internally is dealing with. So, what is it that sort of you represent? So can you converse with them? Can you be literate in those concepts? The metrics is definitely harder.
Well, I was actually going to ask because, like, we've talked about like the journey of a designer. So like mid-level designers probably don't need to be worrying about metrics yet. Like, you probably need to be senior going into lead. At what stage do you think maybe it's too early to even be getting them to fully understand the business acumen side of things? Maybe they should actually just be focusing on the craft. Like, what does that, I guess, designer journey look like from an education perspective as they grow?
It might depend on, again, which kind of designer. If you're, say, a UX designer, and there's a very clear objective you're trying to achieve, which links downstream perhaps to commercial outcomes, but at the interaction point, it's about actions that you're seeking that user to be able to do or to do more easily. Maybe you don't need to know the bigger picture. I guess my world, yeah, some UX in my digital days, but broadly I've been more in that business designer, strategic designer, service designer sort of world. And I think as a junior designer early on, I still think you need some level of awareness and literacy in what is the bigger picture, like what is your role in the organization. And I think that's true for anyone in any role in an organization more and more these days, to understand how you contribute to the bigger picture. So at least something. And again, the more bigger picture or nebulous, I guess, as it gets to this real strategic design, like that has a real commercial, strategic kind of lens to it too. So you need to sort of understand the context and the outcomes that you're seeking more and more.
Now, next question is probably more at that senior end. Like, if you're a senior designer and you're, I guess, working through something, maybe as a service designer and understanding a product market fit, like, or trying to take off a new project, like, how do you sort of build out an understanding of what the metrics should be before kicking off projects? So, like, what's the return on investment back to the business? How am I going to measure this project at each stage to know if it's on track or off track? Like, how do you bring it all together so you know that things are working, and it's going to have a material impact back to the business, and you can report that material impact back as you go, not just try and work it out at the end?
I think there's two layers to it, and it really depends on the organization, and it depends on what kind of industry that you're in. So again, if you go back to that B2C example, it may be that what you're working on has direct impact to, let's say, the customer, and there are measurable metrics that you can point to. A lot of my experience has been really intermediated B to B to C kind of knock-on effects and so on, where you might understand how it all works and the commerciality, but it's far harder to measure the impact that what you've designed for, let's say, a broker or an intermediary or a channel partner has then gone on to have a direct impact on customer sales or retention or something like that. So the short answer is it depends. The longer answer is that two-level thing. So that's external metrics that we're talking about initially. I think that's where you're going, like a real sort of churn, retention, take up, share of wallet, that sort of thing. There's also an internal sort of adoption metric that I tend to focus on more as the harder metric. So for us, and this is true at NBN and it's true elsewhere in previous roles, as an enabler where you don't really own go-to-market, product, operations, a bunch of other stuff. You're an enabler. So then what are your enabling metrics first? And then what are the sort of knock-on, if you like, metrics that you're trying to impact? So enabling metrics could be adoption of your tools. So when you're working, feedback's nice and that sort of thing, but the real sort of harder internal outcome is are the teams or the stakeholders that you're building your journeys, concepts, frameworks, tools, that sort of thing, are they actually being adopted and used? Did they form part of the go-to-market or part of the plan or part of the product or the product feature in launch? And then what effect did that have? But if you're not cracking the first one, then you're not sort of getting anywhere, if that makes sense.
There was so many good actionable takeaways from this. Like, I think if I was a design leader, it'd probably give me a really good starting point where to sort of start educating the team or myself in that matter. So where to look, how to do it. So Scott, I really appreciate your time today. It was fantastic. I learned heaps, so I imagine anyone watching would. If anyone wants to connect, ask any more questions, or just reach out, what's the best way? Via LinkedIn?
Yeah, find me on LinkedIn, absolutely.
Amazing. Once again, it was an absolute pleasure, Scott. Thanks.
Thanks, Joe. Very welcome.